And your highest rank?
I retired as a Major United States Air Force Reserve.
Okay. And what locations did you serve?
My active duty location was at the 390th Strategic Missile Wing, 571st Strategic Missile Squadron, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Tucson, Arizona, from 31 October 1965 to, from 01 October 1965 to 31 March 1970. After that, I went into the Air Force Reserve, working with the 9004th Air Reserve Squadron, primarily in Connecticut.
Okay, and you spent most of your time in Arizona, right?
That is correct. All my active duty time, aside from tech schools, was in Arizona.
And you actually were commissioned in the Air Force.
I was commissioned in the Air Force as a second lieutenant on 14 June 1965 at the University of Massachusetts, Detachment 370, along with, say, about 13 other people who had completed the Air Force ROTC course.
And do you recall the date you were commissioned?
14 June 1965.
And where was that?
Amherst, Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts, on graduation day.
And why did you pick the branch of service?
I had always wanted to be in the United States Air Force. I never really gave any thought to any other branch of service. Not quite sure why, but I always wanted to be an Air Force officer, always wanted to be an Air Force pilot. My life plan at the time was to get my degree, get my commission, earn my wings, fly for the Air Force, retire as a late colonel, and then die at age 42, because I could see no life outside the Air Force. As it happened, didn't happen that way.
Where did you go for training when you were in the Air Force? Commission,
yeah.
Where did you go for training?
Okay, well, for officer training, we spent a lot of time in Amherst, Massachusetts, and in our junior, senior summer, we went to Dow Air Force Base, Bangor, Maine, which is now Bangor International Jetport, where I had the chance to see the Strategic Air Command in action, and also to observe the U.S. Air Force Reserve F-89s and the Air Guard F-101s in action. It was enlightening. As far as actual tech training, I went through the OBR 1821 F course for missile officers at Shepherd Air Force Base, Texas, from November 65 to March of 66. And then I did 6 weeks EWO training at Vandenberg Air Force Base from March of 66 to April 66. And then I did 6 weeks of upgrade to the Missile Force and was certified as a launch officer on or about 1 May 1966. And then I entered onto life as a Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander on Crew R116.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
No. I was not impressed with the course of instruction.
And how did you get through it?
We drank a lot. I guess I shouldn't say that, but northern Texas in winter is one of the bleakest places I can think of, especially if you're in a town that hates the Air Force anyway. And if you were in the Air Force and if you were not a member of this particular sect of the Christian church, you were basically a non-person. So we would we would be on our tech schools were 8 to 12 hours a day, and basically we would either be in school or sleeping or drinking at the O Club, because we were all 21 and 22, and we were all on TDY.
After training, where did you go?
After training, I went to Vandenberg, where I witnessed a launch of a Titan II, which was going to be the bird that I was going to be working on. And I then was returned to the 390th Strat Missile Wing in Tucson and for my upgrade and my subsequent active duty service.
And what was your assignment there?
My assignment was initially Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander for the Titan II weapon system, such as you see here. Um, uh, I believe my AFSC at that time was 1821F. When I upgraded to Deputy, I became an 1823F. 18 months later, when I upgraded to Commander and got my own crew, my AFSC was 1825F. So I was a 5 level.
And let's see. So you were basically in Arizona as a crew member
As
the whole time?
as a member of an ICBM launch crew.
Describe a typical day for your service.
Typical day, it was pretty well laid out. We would get up around 0400, leave the house by 0500. The briefing would start at 0600. That would take oftentimes anywhere between 1 and say 2.5 hours, where they would brief us on the activities of the day, anything that was coming up. We would have to take any number of proficiency tests, exams, that sort of stuff. And one crew would have to demonstrate their proficiency in safety equipment. Then we go out to the vehicles, and they were station wagons. And by that time, our enlisted men would have picked up the food, and then we got into the vehicles and headed out. Now, the food was an early version of the TV dinners, and it was awful. It was prepared by amateurs, and it looked like dog food and tasted kind of like dog food. So what usually happened is we would depart the base in true military style. We'd all pull into the 7-Eleven, and we'd get out and we'd buy some real food. And then we'd all get back in our cars and head out to the site. Arriving at the site, we would meet the crew that was already on duty, and we would then commence the changeover process, which for the officers consisted of verifying every single piece of classified printed material on site and getting a full maintenance briefing on what was going on, what the problems of the bird were, et cetera, et cetera. And then we would start the changeover process, during which time the high point of the changeover process was the handing over of the launch documents and the launch keys, which the on-duty crew took, and they would hand off to the oncoming commander and deputy. And when that happened, the oncoming crew was now in charge.
Let me ask you one question. The bird was what?
The bird was the Titan II, Martin Titan II, LGM 25C. She was 110 feet long, 10 feet in diameter, 9 megaton warhead, weighed 335,000 pounds at liftoff, of which 300,000 pounds was propellants and 10,000 pounds was the warhead. And we could, the theory was that we could toss this puppy 6,000 to 9,000 nautical miles in any direction based on whatever the targeting was. And we could launch, and this thing would be out of the hole within 59 seconds of key turn. So our reaction time would have been 59 seconds. And to actually do a launch, we needed 2 officer concurrence and the concurrence of the wing command post. We always had a launch disable signal being sent to us over a soft VHF antenna. And the feeling was that in the event of a nuclear blast nearby, would sweep everything away topside except the silo closure door, and would also blow the antenna away. Once we lost the signal, we have an automatic launch enable signal, and the crew would then verify any launch messages that came in through UHF or ultra low frequency or any number of ways. And if the launch message or the action message was confirmed and we agreed in what it says, we would then take the appropriate actions. We trained to do simulated launches about twice a day, and the launch signal or the message signal would be a very loud warble tone, like a deedle 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 deedle, and it just blew your mind. And we had to clear everybody out of the control site, out of the control center, and work our magic. And then if we had to do something serious, as in go to war, well, then there was lots of other actions we would take. But assuming if we had to do an actual launch, we would have computed our proper launch time, advised Wing Command Post when we were going to launch, and then at the appointed time, turn keys on this thing. And the idea was that it would then clear the site, and once it cleared the site, once all the plugs pulled out, this bird was on its own. You couldn't turn it, you couldn't change it, you couldn't explode it. Wherever the Air Force had programmed it to go, it was going to go. My standard joke was that I didn't care as long as it didn't go straight up and come straight down. I mean, whether it went to Moscow or Patagonia, I didn't care. That was above my pay grade. My job was to get that thing out of the hole. So I did.
Was the warhead
Thermal
armed after it got out?
Well, the warhead arming was apparently like a 14-step process, which involved accelerometers, barometric altitudes, G-forces, et cetera, and the thing would arm itself in several steps on the way up and really wouldn't be fully armed until coming in at about 16,000 miles an hour through the atmosphere and decelerating. And I guess the final step in the arming process when the warhead would hit 14 Gs or something like that as it was decelerating, and then it would be programmed for either an air burst or a ground burst. An air burst was 35,000 feet, and that meant that the fireball would not touch the ground. A ground burst was programmed at 8,000 feet, which meant that the fireball, which was 7 miles across, would touch the ground and would do all kinds of terrible stuff. These things functioned by blast, heat, and radiation. The heat would radiate outward at the speed of light. So, and it would be 10 million degrees at the center of this thing. This was a thermonuclear reaction. Okay, we use an A-bomb to start the reaction. And so the heat would come out first. The blast would come out as a shock wave at the speed of sound, and then the radiation would be, there'd be instant alpha and beta radiation, and then gamma radiation come, and of course there'd be fallout. These things were designed for all-out war, and they were not designed to be selective. They were designed to kill everything within a specific radius, in this case, 900 square miles. If this is a map of Tucson, and 900 square miles would encompass every missile area in this. This is about a 900 square mile radius, okay? And that was 100% fatality and 100% destruction. This thing could start a fire out to 60 miles and could cause third-degree burns out to 80 miles or 90 miles, depending on atmospherics and stuff like that. So this was a truly nasty weapon designed to finish World War III. We would never launch. It was a part of our training that we would never launch this thing first. It was called preemptive. We would never launch preemptively. But once we had endured the first strike, the surviving missile sites would then launch retaliatory strikes and would then take out the whatever Russian targets had been forecast, which is why we had 3 targets on this thing. And we could target 1, 2, or 3, air bursts or ground bursts. We did not know what the targets were. We could figure it out pretty well. If it was an air burst, it was probably a city. If it was a ground burst, it was probably some sort of communication center or missile site. But we only had 54 of these things. And the Air Force also had 1,000 Minutemen, each of which had a 1 megaton warhead. So if they're going to pepper small targets, airfields and that sort of stuff, they'd use the Minutemen. If they were going to go after something very serious or very hardened, they'd use the Titan II. And the Polaris missiles at sea would also do their thing. Don't forget, at this point, I'm told that we had something to the order of 35,000 nuclear warheads, of which, say, 6,000 might be might be active at any given time. And somebody told me that Moscow was targeted by 800 different sorties. So Moscow would have been, the entire country would have been radioactive glass. Then again, all the United States would have been radioactive glass also. This is nuclear warfare.
Okay, so you told me that when you were in, you received the keys from the past team.
Yep.
Then what would happen?
Well, then we would accept them. We would verify that the seals had not been broken on the launch documents.
And was it an actual key?
Yeah, like a little house key. The Russians had this huge thing with like a big skeleton key. We had a little house key, and the key slot was covered and had a little lead seal on it. And part of our oncoming thing was to verify that the lead seal had not been broken. If the lead seal was broken, the world fell in, because SAC was dead nuts serious about nuclear safety. And all of our motivational briefings generally ended with screw up and you'll go to Leavenworth, as in the Leavenworth prison. And your career is over, whatever. Lose a piece of paper and you can kiss your career goodbye. Lose a piece of secret and you kiss your career goodbye and you go to prison, so on and so forth. This was called motivation in Strategic Air Command, because SAC was on a wartime footing for 46 years. She was stood up on 1946, and she was stood down in 1992. And we were the long-range nuclear strike arm of the United States Air Force. Our job was to deliver death on a massive scale to the enemy, Red Russia, to the other superpower, just as their Strategia Raketny forces, their job was to deliver nuclear death on a massive basis to us. This is called mutual assured destruction.
Okay, so what I'm driving at is when then you went to the silo, is that?
Okay, well, basically, our day after that, the officers would spend their time in the control center, because this was a liquid-fueled bird that had to be kept plus or minus 1 degree Fahrenheit and plus or minus 1 psi in the tanks, and they put it in the desert, which has a 60-degree swing between midnight and noon, and so we had pumps and we had a lot of pumps and devices and motors, etc., all shock mounted, I might add, to bounce up and down, all designed to keep the interior of the launch silo at a constant 72 degrees. Constant. It could not vary. More than 2 degrees up and the propellants would boil, more than 2 degrees down and the propellants would gel. So it had to be kept within a very tight tolerance, and all of our days were concentrated with bringing maintenance people on board to keep all the pumps and stuff to keep this bird going. Okay? So the officers spent most of our time working with the maintenance guys. Whenever after they'd go home, then we would oftentimes do our training, and we would oftentimes get our exercise messages and all that sort of stuff to do sort of stuff. Sometimes they give it to us in the middle of the day, and we'd have to stop everything, push everybody out of the control center, copy our messages, and take the actions that were specified by the messages. And they were all coded messages and all that sort of stuff.
Okay. And there was you were in the whole silo for 24 hours?
We were underground for 24 hours straight, yeah. Now, the silo itself with the missile was in its own, was within a secondary cocoon in which it was 165 feet deep, about 40 feet in diameter. The actual launch silo was about 20 feet in diameter, and all the equipment was clustered around in the silo. It was connected to the control center by a long cableway, and you can see here, this is the view of the long cableway going down, which connected to a series of blast doors, which were theoretically pressurized to either 300 or 1,000 psi. I could never figure out which, but they were huge. And then we had the control center, and the control center was where we actually did the work from. Our two enlisted men, he was called the Missile Facilities Technician, otherwise known as a plumber, and we had the ballistic missile analyst technician. He was the computer guy, and he was theoretically in charge of making sure the warhead stayed on alert. They wouldn't tell us anything about the warhead. In fact, our daily shift verification to check the warhead was 2 buttons. We pressed one button that said pressure, and if it lighted, that's good. We pressed another button that said continuity, and if that lighted, that was good. That's all we needed to know. Even our confidential tech data, our -1A, showed a blank space in the warhead. I didn't know what the thing looked like until maybe 40 years later when I saw a dummy version of the Mark 53 warhead, which is now on display at the visitor center. And the thing is, for a 9 to 10 megaton thing, it's about the size of this table. It's about 5.5, 6 feet long, and about this wide. It looks kind of like a thermos bottle, and it weighs 8,000 pounds. You know, but like I say, so. But if those lights didn't light, the first thing we did before we panicked was to change the light bulbs. If the light bulbs still didn't light, then we contacted Wing Command Post. The world would fall in. Command Post had to we had an immediate what's called broken arrow. The bird was off alert. SAC headquarters came on the thing. People would go bananas, and because that's when we found out just how important these particular warheads were to the overall strategic, integrated operational plan, the PSYOP as we called it. Because if one of these things went off alert, SAC was all over us until we could get the thing back on alert. And if the warhead went off alert, we were down for 2 or 3 days until they get a new warhead out there and read and do all their magic stuff.
And the conditions in the silo were not good, right? You had a lot of noise and
in the control center. Okay, in the control center, this was before OSHA. Now, of course, OSHA now mandates that the average work condition should be no more than 72 decibels, and the lighting should be good, blah, blah, blah. This is before OSHA. So our average noise level is between 80 and 85 decibels for 24 hours. We had fans, we had motors, we had phones ringing, we had radios crackling, we had people wandering through, and this was in a steel dome structure, so where all the noise just kind of bounced off each other. There was no soundproofing. The floor was tile, which we had to clean, I might add, once a day. And so basically the cumulative noise level meant that we had an effective working life of about 30 hours maximum. And on days when we were stuck on nuclear exercises, we found that after 36 hours we would literally be bumping into each other. After 24 hours we were done. 30 hours we could do maybe. We were primarily young guys. I was 24 when I got my own crew. The rest of my crew was younger than I was.
And your crew was 4 people.
My crew was 4 people, 2 officers and 2 enlisted. My deputy was a first lieutenant. I had 4 deputy commanders during the time I was crew commander, and they cycled through and they got their own crews and things like that. And they were charged with learning how to be a crew commander. And we had our 2 enlisted men, and they had specific duties. But our main duty was to be ready to get the keys. And in the early days, because we were nuclear custodians, carrying launch documents and the key, we had to be armed. I don't know how other wings did it, but my crew commanders said, well, if you're a nuclear custodian, you will wear your 38 snub nose at all times. And I says, even in bed? And he says, yes. I says, we're all alone. We're underground. We're surrounded by 40 feet of dirt and steel and concrete. And he says, so we had to wear our guns to bed. Later on, when we were allowed to take our documents off, put them in the safe, then we were permitted to. Then we could take our guns off and hang them on the bedpost. But up to that, and so we would get perhaps 2 to 3 hours of sleep per 24-hour shift. And late at night, after all starting around 2 o'clock, we would go into the cleaning routine because the silo and the control center had to be in pristine condition for the new crew coming on. Otherwise, the new crew had the option of refusing the site if it wasn't clean enough. So at 0400 in the morning, when our replacements were just waking up, we would be on our hands and knees with a rag and a bottle of 409, making little circles in the tile to erase all the rubber scuff marks, and then buffing, and then using a floor buffer. My first job when I got off active duty, I was able to get it because I knew how to run a floor buffer. And they said, "You're an officer." I said, "Yes." I said, "But I was a Strategic Air Command. I know how to run a floor buffer." And that's a true story. And then on weekends, we had huge springs. Now the springs had to be dusted every day, but on the weekends, we would have to dust them and spray them with Pledge, keep them nice and shiny. You cannot go to war with unshiny springs. Now, we had SAC issued shoes, and the shoes were extraordinarily uncomfortable to wear for 24 hours. So one fine day, I decided to I had straps on the side of my crew bag, so I decided to bring bedroom slippers. And my commander looked at me and says, "Lieutenant," says, "what are those?" I says, "Bedroom slippers, sir." Said, "What do you plan to do with those?" I says, "Put them on, sir." "When?" "Well, after everybody goes home, etc., etc." And I could see his mind running. He said, what SAC regulation would I be violating by wearing slippers? And he couldn't come up with one. And I said, "Sir, if it makes you feel any better, if we get the order to launch in the middle of the night, before we launch, I will take my slippers off, I'll have my shoes on, and I will be in proper uniform before we commit to a nuclear action." The guy looked at me and he said, "But good, yeah, that'll do. And at that point I says, "Oh boy, what have I gotten into?" I had to keep it, you had to have a sense of humor, because the psychological pressures were fierce. I tell the story about a blue helmet. Now, you'll notice that the blue helmet is just blue plastic. It was done that way. And they told me, says, now you have to have a blue helmet. I said, "I got one." They said, no, it has to be painted." I said, "What color?" They said, "Blue." I said, well, how do I do it?" He says, "Well, you take this, and the first thing you do is you spray paint it white with primer." So, okay, he says, "Then you spray paint it blue." I said, "Why don't we just wear, as is?" He says, "Because the SAC regulations specify white primer and blue paint, and by gum, Lieutenant, you think you know better than SAC headquarters." I said, "Of course not, sir." You'll notice that we wore the SAC ribbon on everything. That's to show that all the SAC airplanes had one, SAC missiles had one, and our helmets had one to show that we were SAC people. And like I said, there was no sense of humor. No sense of humor. Later on, the Minuteman people could do songs and stuff like that. We weren't even allowed to have a TV downstairs. Okay? However, and I think the statute of limitations has expired. The day I was on duty, the day that Apollo 11 was launched, and we had a full maintenance thing. We had maybe 50 people in the control center, and I said to the assembled people, I says, "Gentlemen, I don't know about you, but I intend to watch the launch of Apollo 11 because this is history." And I could say, "Oh, can't do that." And I said, "I'm doing it on my own recording since I'm the commander. Therefore, I shall." And I said, "If any of you wish to go about your duties and polish the springs or fix the pumps, knock yourself out. I'm going to watch the launch. You are all welcome to watch with me." So we violated regulations. We brought the television downstairs, and I watched the launch of Apollo 11 in utter violation of SAC regulations, and every other person there watched it along with me.
You were never in combat, right?
No.
Did you ever have any casualties?
Yes. We had the missile site had a number of extraordinary hazards. We had 3,000 psi air. We had the propellants were toxic, fatally toxic in concentrations of anything greater than 5 parts per million. We had burn problems, we had electrical problems. Our visitor safety briefing generally ran half an hour. And the one casualty that I know of, we were doing an exercise and pumping open one of the blast doors. The blast doors not only had their own hydraulic system to open these large pins that would retract, and we could get these welded steel I-beams filled with concrete to swing open. Well, they said, we're going to simulate that the hydraulic system doesn't work. We have a portable hydraulic unit, and one of my enlisted men was pumping open the thing, and it was a quick disconnect, and the QD failed, and things swung across, spraying him with hydraulic fluid into his eyes. Well, of course, they say, in the event of a hydraulic leak, walk the person over to the eye wash and have him put his eyes there. It took all 4 of us, all the 3 of us, to hold this guy, one holding his body, one holding his arm, one holding his head, to hold him into the eye wash, and he was screaming like you read about. Extraordinarily painful. He was essentially blinded for about 12 hours. We called the wing command post, said, please send somebody else out. They said, well, is he still capable of standing? I said, yes. Said, we're going to, in that case, stay with him. And they wouldn't send anybody else out. Now, we did have the missile system as a whole did have a couple of serious fatalities. They were doing some major maintenance once, and at this particular silo, and a welder cut a 3,000 psi hydraulic line with a welding torch, and the torch swung. The hydraulic fluid caught fire. It burned immediately, sucked all the air out of the silo, and asphyxiated 54 people. 1 person survived, and that's only because he happened to be near the blast door. So, and we had a couple of propellant explosions within the system itself, never at Davis-Monthan, but Little Rock had 2 explosions where seals were punctured or the fuel tank was punctured, and the 2 propellants came in contact with each other, and there was a massive explosion. Fireball was about a quarter of a mile across. The warhead was blown out of the silo, found over a half mile away. The entire site was destroyed, and the crew, because of the blast doors, was saved. So that's one of the reasons why they got rid of why they decided to deactivate this thing, because it was a big one, but it was getting kind of old. Now, the Titan II later became the core of the Titan III and Titan IV heavy launch vehicle systems used by the United States Air Force, and all the warbirds were recycled into space launch vehicles. So they're all used.
How did you stay in touch with your family while you were in the...
Telephones. Yeah, and on weekends, if you wanted to bring your family out to the site, you could. I brought my wife out, brought my mother out, friends, whatever. You had to get permission from the wing commander. By and large, it was okay. And we could call. We weren't cut off by any means from the world. And the fact we were only gone 30 hours at a time helped keep a little bit of peace at home. The people I really felt sorry for were the SAC ground troops, or the SAC troops like with the B-52s. They were kept in a situation similar to ours for a week at a time. Okay?
What was the food like?
Terrible. SAC tried the best they could. They tried to come up with good food, but it was always sabotaged by the cooks. It always gave us gas, and we which is why we always got about an equal measure of Gelusil along with the food. And whenever possible, we'd try to get, as I said, we'd stop at 7-Eleven and buy some real food rather than eat the SAC-provided food. SAC tried the best they could. I mean, they had their own laundry, so that all of our white uniforms, similar to this is a reconstruction, was a white cotton bag, which was so highly starched that things seemed, literally, you could stand them in the corner by themselves without a hanger. And when you put your foot into it, you could hear as your foot was parting the highly starched stuff. And they looked very great until you sat down, in which case you got highly starched wrinkles. And at the end of 30 hours, it was highly starched, really awful looking bag. But this was the uniform that we wore in the mid 60s. Later on, we got blue suits. Later on, we got blue bags. The current people now use flight suits.
Did you feel under great stress?
Oh yeah, did I? The answer is yes. It was stressed to us that we were the pointy end of the spear. That if anything went wrong, it was the commander's fault. If somebody fell down and broke something, it was the commander's fault, even if he wasn't there. If the bird went off alert and we had to miss a major target, it was the commander's fault. So the answer is yes, stress. I like to think of my war wounds as hemorrhoids and ulcers.
Did you have any humorous instances while you were on duty?
As I said, they aside from the shoe incident that I told you earlier,
The shoe incident?
the shoe incident where I told you I could I could wear my slippers but have my shoes on, things like that. There wasn't an awful lot of humor there. For Christmas once, a group of junior officers and some sergeants came up with a poem, very similar to a biblical thing that had the problems of the pushes of buttons and the watches of lights, as we were called, where we had completed our thing, and would we please get some success and some rest, and the commander emerged from the place where the beer flows, and they said, "No, you have not done all that was required. Therefore, ye shall hear my wrath. Ye shall have twice as many back-to-backs and twice as many deedle-deals." And we said, "Yea, verily, our lot is." Yeah, we thought it was hilarious. They didn't. That guy almost got an Article 15 out of it. But like I said, now later on, as the years went by, they kind of loosened up a little bit. But in the early days, there was no humor whatsoever. Period.
What did you think of your fellow officers and fellow servicemen?
They were a dedicated bunch. They had to be. We were selected. We had to. We went through extensive psychological evaluations to determine if we could put up with this kind of stuff, and for officers to determine if we could actually turn keys and launch the bird. We were all volunteers. Anytime we wanted to get off the force, all we had to say was, "Sir, I can't turn keys." Done. You're gone. You wouldn't be out of SAC. You'd wind up in charge of the warehouse or something like that, but you would be off the missile force totally. If you had any problems that showed instability, if you started passing bad checks, if you turned gay, if you were getting a divorce or something like that, bango, off the force, because you had to have absolute stability people. A little bit of humor, perhaps. They tried to come up with this motto, SAC's motto, PRIDE, professional results in daily effort. And they had it on everything. And then somebody, who shall remain nameless, pointed out that could also mean, "Pussy really is delicious, eat it." It went like wildfire through the wing. All the signs came down. And I didn't get a very good evaluation that year. I'm not quite sure how. Which may explain why I retired as a major.
Where were you when your service ended?
I was in Tucson when my service ended, and my wife was teaching in the Tucson school system. She had noticed, she was teaching primarily in the military schools. She taught there 2 years. Her first year, she was teaching in an area that was primarily officers' kids. Second year, she was teaching primarily enlisted kids. And I asked her how it went, and she said, "Honey, you wouldn't believe it." That's why. She says, "The officers would ask me, 'What have you done for my child today?' The enlisted men would ask me, 'What can my child do to make himself better?'" And she said it was like between night and day. So we stayed in Tucson until her teaching contract expired. And by that time, I'd gotten a job in the real world.
And what was that job?
Well, I went through a number of jobs. My first job was is in retail, where I became, among other things, a watchmaker. I knew nothing about watches, but I did know how to pop the back of the watch and make grunting sounds and sell watches. And we had all kinds of. That's Montgomery Ward, so they were out of business, so I can say this. But eventually, I found a job with an insurance company, Hartford Insurance Group, and I found a job working with the engineering division. Now, I'm not an engineer; I'm a history major. But they said, well, you can't be a safety guy. You're not an engineer. I said, this is what I did in the Air Force. I launched missiles. And I said, wow. Okay, we'll make you probationary. I was a probationary safety engineer for 28 years because I wasn't an engineer. So I said, okay, that's fine. But all the SAC was bananas about safety. Absolute safety, everything. So it was kind of natural that I would find the slot as a safety engineer in industry working with insurance companies. And that's what I did for the next 28 years.
Did you go back to school after you got out of the service? Did
No.
You ever go back? No, you didn't.
No.
How about...
Well, I take that back. I did use my VA benefits to get my commercial pilot license. I had hopes of being a commercial pilot, and then once I got the ticket, I took a look at the job prospects and realized I did not wish to be poverty-stricken for that long. So basically, I stayed in the safety field.
Did you make any close friendships in the service?
No, not really.
And you didn't keep in contact with anybody, right?
Well, yes and no. I am part of a group called the 390th Strategic Missile Wing Memorial Association, which was started after the wing was deactivated in 1986. And we have reunions every 2 years. And every other year, our reunion is at Tucson, and we go out to the missile silo and things like that. And so I have friends from the missile field, and I'm also a life member of the Association of Air Force Missileers, and so I have acquaintances within that group. We are all of a common background. Did I know these people when I was on active duty? No. Did I, but can we at least talk missiles together? Yeah, and so I have acquaintances, but friends? No. My wife had a very good friend that we kept in touch with a couple of years. But they say that was Arizona. We lived in Connecticut. There was nothing happening.
How did your military experience influence your thinking about war or the military in general?
It didn't. War is extraordinarily wasteful. It's expensive. It's deadly. I knew that going in. And unlike tactical bombing or that sort of stuff, where you're concerned with shooting 1 or 2 people and the My Lai massacres and all that sort of junk, had we been unleashed, it was our job to cause death and destruction on a massive scale. That was our job. Okay? If we did not believe in the cause, we had no business being there. And as I said, we're all volunteers, so would we have, all we had to do to get off the force was, I can't turn keys, I will not turn keys. We didn't know what our targets were. All we knew was that the Air Force says you will launch at a specific time on target 3 with an airburst from your console. Done. And after that, by the way, we had no post-war orders. We figured there wasn't going to be a base to go back to. We had 2 weeks of food for 4 people, or 4 weeks of food for 2 people, or 8 weeks of food for 1 person, and as we used to say, the officers have the guns. Presuming we could get back to the surface, which was not a given.
Do you belong to any veterans organizations?
Well, of course, as a Vietnam era veteran, I am not entitled to belong to the VVA, or the VFW, or the AMVETS, or any of those things, because you have to go overseas. So the only veterans organization I belong to are the missile-connected ones, the Association of Air Force Missileers, the 390th Strategic Missile Wing Memorial Association, and the Air Force Association. I'm a life member of all 3 of those organizations.
How did your service and experience affect your life?
As I said, I had always wanted to be a 20-year officer. My entire life was built around the concept of a 20-year career in the United States Air Force. When that proved unworkable, I went into the reserves and I did the best I could to continue that service. And I spent 20 years in the reserves working with young people with the Civil Air Patrol as liaison, becoming, in essence, the voice and the image of the Air Force to these young folks. So, and I still do that, but basically my job was, after I got out, was to be the image, and to be Mr. Air Force to these kids.
Is there anything you'd like to add that has not been covered in this interview?
Oh boy. Not that I can think of. I am a veteran. I am extraordinarily. I have a love-hate relationship with Strategic Air Command. I am extraordinarily proud of having served in that group, but I'm equally happy to have gotten out without having gone to jail. I wish that I could have gotten out of SAC and into the real Air Force, because I've heard the stories of the real Air Force, TAC, ADC, USAFE, all those kind of places. And the people's experience there don't mirror anything like SAC. We were warrior monks, for lack of a better term. Kurt LeMay expected us all to be totally committed all the time to our task, and these people are. 50 years later, we still have people on alert. They're still underground. We still have 450 land-based ICBMs. And every day, 24/7, 365, there are people underground waiting on nuclear alert, hoping that they don't have to launch, but if they do, prepared to do so. And all we need is targets.
Thank you for your service and also for taking the time for the interview today.
You're most welcome. Thank you for letting me talk.